So my name is Oliver Broadbent and I'm going to be the chair for today's conversation. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Now we have a great lineup in response to our question, what is regenerative design? Some changes from the advertised lineup, so I'm just going to give you a brief run through of the speakers. We have Michael Paulin from Exploration Architecture, who is standing in for Sarah Ichioka, who was not able to make it today. Thank you, Michael. We have Kieran Malik. We have Anthony Davis from 3Adapt, and we have Adele Horton from Harvard. So thank you, all of you, for coming in to speak today. I'll just say a few opening things. When I talk to people about regenerative design quite a lot, I'm discovering something odd has started happening. And that is that I find the conversation, maybe surprisingly, can get a little bit hostile quite quickly. Maybe a surprising thing to hear, but I'm definitely feeling it. And I've been trying to think about why is that? And I think that in general, there is a growing sense that we can't repair and restore and encourage our ecosystems to thrive again by just doing less and less and less, by becoming more efficient, by building less. That agenda gets us pretty quickly to kind of doing nothing and grinding to a halt. And I think there's a almost emerging from the system, understanding that if actually we want to repair our ecosystems and we want to enable human flourishing, we need to find a new way, a new pattern for working. And I think the problem is that when people, particularly in engineering, look around them and then see how projects are structured, see where their clients are at, see their relationships and supply chain, see the materials that they work with, see finance and legislation, all stacked up in the current extractive system. And they think, wow, how do I get out of this? And so I think that's where this sort of hostility, or at least defensiveness, comes from, because maybe they realize, and all of us realize, that what we've trained up in, the system that we're all part of, is no longer serving us, but we don't necessarily know what to do next. I'm very fortunate this year to have been able to initiate a new project with a team of collaborators called the Regenerative Design Lab. And the idea of the lab is to actually create a space where practicing engineers and construction industry professionals can actually explore, what does regenerative design mean in practice? A safe space where we can explore it. And these are leaders and future leaders, and they are coming together. The process has just begun. It's going to last 6 months. And I'm really excited to see what will emerge from this space. Anyone that's familiar with the 3 Horizons model developed by Bill Sharp for thinking about what is the elements of the future that we can see now. The model has this idea of the 3rd horizon, the horizon that we can't see, the thing we're trying to get to, and tries to get us to find what are the elements of the future that exist now. And if through this lab, we can encourage our colleagues and wider industry to identify those regenerative elements that exist already, then maybe we can tune into those and collectively enhance those and accelerate our understanding towards regenerative practice and our understanding, and therefore hopefully the design and creation and enhancement of those regenerative systems. That's my hope, at least. No more from me other than to introduce our first speaker, who is going to be Michael. So Michael, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks for involving me. And as Oliver said, I'm standing in for Sarah Ichioka. So Sarah and I wrote this book together, Flourish. So equal credit to Sarah for everything I'm about to say. And the starting point for the book was really the IPCC report in 2018, which made it clear that 30 years of sustainable design had not got us anywhere near to where we need to be. And Sarah and I were inspired by the systems thinker Donella Meadows, who argued that the best way to change something is to change the mindset that drives the system, mindset or paradigm that drives the system. So we became convinced that we really need to make a shift from sustainable to regenerative. And the kind of shortcomings that we were thinking about with sustainability was that it was largely about mitigating negatives It tended to be rather anthropocentric, and it was also mechanistic. And so we need to kind of transcend and include all the best aspects of sustainability, but to widen some of those perspectives, and also to challenge some of the existing frames that may be maladaptive, and to propose more regenerative frames for those. And in our book, we've tried to answer what does regenerative mean, and we still think it's a very open debate and a really important one to have. But we make the case for 5 really fundamental shifts, and each of those is the basis of a chapter. And the first chapter looks at how we transform our ideas of agency, our capacity to bring about change. And we use the term possibilism to be distinct from optimism or pessimism. So both of those imply that the future is inevitable and that you either feel positive or negative towards it. And so possibilism is about deciding on the future you want, and then you need to set about creating it. And so we describe the characteristics of possibilist thinking, which include the idea that the future can be influenced, evidence-based action, and challenging maladaptive frames. In chapter 2, we look at the whole relationship between humans and nature. We particularly look at some of the sort of dominant worldviews. When I say dominant, I'm not saying that everyone on this call subscribes to them, but the kind of dominant basis of our economies tend to be based on an idea of conquest of nature, seeing nature as something separate and as something that can be plundered for resources. And so we propose a very different view, and we build on the work of people like Jeremy Lent and the philosopher Freya Matthews, looking at how we completely overcome that dualism, that separation from nature. And ultimately, what we need to get to is the point where we are participating as nature. In chapter 3, we look at time and make the case for long-term thinking and qualitative aspects of time. And as one example of the kind of maladaptive frames that we challenge, the idea that time is money, that's been repeated so many times that no one seems to know who actually first said it. And it starts to develop an air of sort of unassailable truth about it. And it takes someone as progressive as Karma Chatim from Bhutan to propose a new story, which is time is life. Time's not money, time is life. And I think that encourages us to actually ask deeper questions about what our long-term purpose is. In chapter 4, we rethink human nature and look at some of the social science that suggests a lot of the stories we've been told about humans being self-interested and savage and so on are actually very inaccurate and unhelpful. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that humans are remarkably cooperative. We have an amazing capacity for altruism and cooperation and empathy. And if we were to use that as the basis of the built environment, it would lead to very different models, such as the 15-minute city. In chapter 5, we rethink growth, and we put forward the case that neither growth nor degrowth are satisfactory purposes for an economy. And the purpose we put forward is the maximization of planetary health. And we argue that Kate Raworth's donut economics is the model that is best aligned to that. And then in the conclusions, we draw together a list of all these shifts from the 5 chapters. And we acknowledge that some of those might look pretty daunting. But actually, it's worth thinking about the prize that's on offer, because we really could create a very positive future with an abundance of shared facilities. We could, with rewilding, we could start to shifting baseline in the opposite direction as we re-inhabit ecosystems and restore them, and increasingly inhabit a new role as designers, as co-enablers of the flourishing of all life for all time. Thank you.
Wow, a round of applause for Michael. Thank you very much for that. Many people have been muted there, but I'm sure they will have all been applauding a very impressive collection of words in exactly 5 minutes. Thank you very much for starting us off, Michael, and I look forward to hearing people's questions when we get into the discussion part. Right, I'm going to hand over straight on to Kian. Over to you, Kian. Are you ready?
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you very much.
Screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. So let me just get this smaller. So thanks for inviting me. I start off at a similar place that Michael said, actually, but I haven't found a better way of starting any talk than this diagram from the 2018 IPCC report. And it's essentially, if you haven't seen it, it's saying that business as usual leads to a very unsustainable planet. That some action to reduce those emissions is better, but it doesn't entirely create a world that we're all going to be able to inhabit pretty happily. And really the trick to this is trying to aim for all sustainable development goals, and that would lead us to a world that we can, is climate resilient. And that's kind of followed up by the 2022 report, which is actually kind of going through each of those different goals and talking about each of the industries that they think could be making changes. And the built environment is one with a basically that impacts most of those sustainable development goals. So when we think about regenerative design, we think about it in terms of engineering and architecture. Engineering and architecture has a big part to play. And I kind of want to think about, I think it's really good to think about the lineage, and I kind of come back to that later, but essentially, this is from Jared Diamond's book on Guns and Steel. And it shows that actually although we have existed for 7 million years, some places we've only populated in the last 1,000 years. And during that period, we were part of an ecosystem. We were part of those systems, those places. And there was a balance to everything that was going on. And we've kind of come to an imbalance. And so then regenerative design is being developed, is in development, is being used. And it's really important to think about the lineage of that process. Bill Reed and Pamela Rang wrote a really good article kind of discussing regenerative design. It's pretty short, so it's worth having a look at. But it kind of talks about how it comes out of this kind of process of understanding the idea of ecosystems, the idea of understanding permaculture, seeing cities as something that lives, and eventually kind of reaching to the point where kind of the Regenesis group, which is the kind of group that I've been learning with, was founded. And so we see kind of diagrams like this quite often, which kind of talking about the scale that we go from conventional to sustainable, and the idea to getting to regenerative, where we're not doing any negative impacts. And it's not this is from the construction draft, consultation draft from Mayor of London on, which is saying it's just where it absorbs carbon. So it's very hard to kind of talk about it in explain the whole of architecture in 5 minutes. So I'm trying to introduce you to regenerative design. So I'd like you all to think of a project in your head, one that you've done or one that you're working on. It could be a personal project, it could be a work project. Just have that in your head. And so one of the things I want you to think about is that whatever that is, that project comes from a process. If it's a personal thing, you have a history and you have a future. And so any project that you do is part of that entire process. And often we see things as discrete start and finish, but really every single piece of work that we do evolves and changes over time. We might design a building that then has an extension made to it, so it becomes larger. And as it's larger, it can't be occupied by a single family, so then maybe it becomes split into apartments for rental. So everything that we do is evolving, and it evolves with its environment, and it has a future. Another thing that I want you to think about with your project you're thinking about is that a lot of the time we think about projects in terms of what can we get out of it? How do we get the most floor area out of this particular project? Or we're very imposing. We say, I want to do this, I want this made. But think about instead your project and the relationships nearby. So buildings, spaces, roads, infrastructure, ecology that is around your building, and how your building or your project could be changed if you were thinking about your project in a relationship with that, and whether or not there was a way that your project and that other thing in your system could both grow at the same time. Yeah, and then the last one that I have is this term, is thinking about the essence. Often we kind of, a lot of the time we think about a lot of projects or work that we do is about complete competition, where we just compete with what's there, or we remove that system, what's there, in order to put something new. And we've seen this in environments. Often we talk about neighborhoods having a particular kind of character to them. And we can see that when they become developed and they become changed, often that character kind of suffers. And then we've also seen that we're situations where, although that project has, oops, that's my alarm to tell me to stop talking. Although that project has changed, sometimes we see that actually it's not entirely successful. And it's not until it actually starts to bring back some of the things that it replaced, embracing that natural, that kind of uniqueness of the place, the essence of the place, that we actually get something that entirely flourishes. Yeah. So those are the points that I wanted you to think about and hold in your mind. And hopefully it's given you a bit of a taste of what regenerative design thinking is to me. The only thing I was going to say is the books that I really like on this, the Regenerative Institute website's got some amazing case studies. And then this integrated design book is actually kind of like a secret regenerative design book, talking about how you integrate it into the design process. And then the last one, which is thinking, not taking, because regenerative doesn't have to be about buildings, it doesn't have to be about design. Carol Sanford's book on regenerative life, it's worth having a look at. And so that's me.
Wow. Okay, and a round of applause for Kian. Thank you very much. I feel I'm going to just have to, so much in these presentations, I feel I'm going to have to go back and listen to the recording, even though I'm here and I'm taking notes. This is rich. And I think these words are profound, and there's a lot to unpack in these. So thank you very much, Kian. Let's go now on to Anthony. Anthony, if you're speaking, we can't hear you, but we can see your slides.
Can you see my?
We can see your slides. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So hopefully, seeing the previous presenters and knowing what's coming, what follows, hopefully I'm going to dive into some different areas just to try and see how we can. There's a lot of great theory. There's a lot of great models. Definitions about regenerative design, but how can we actually implement it? So I've got a few case studies in here where thankfully we've worked with some great leading progressive clients. So this is me, this is our team, small team in Free Adapt, and we like to think about people obviously at the center of what we do, and we're data informed, and basically it's about thinking, how can we hand over this planet in the best shape possible to support future generations? Okay, and that, I think regenerative thinking, philosophies, design is at the heart of that. So in terms of like a position statement, I thought it'd be good just to get this one out there straight away. So I believe that regenerative thinking, strategy and design should be holistic, integrated, and cover more than the traditional areas in our mindsets. When we're designing something for an organization, place, or space, it should run through from the values and culture of those involved in creating the vision, but also when it's delivered and monitored and managed, and how we actually define success and how we look at the people that are potentially existing and living their lives in these places and spaces. So we need a real deep understanding of these people that live, work, learn and play there, but also for an organization as well themselves. So how can we do this? And how can we really put more regenerative thinking at the center of what we do? So one of the case studies just going to touch on quickly is Eden Project. They had a really ambitious global program. This is all on their website to really take their experiences and learnings from the last 20 years being in Cornwall, and actually how can they then share the knowledge and learning to effect positive change across the world and work with some really great communities and clients. And so there was a really progressive development pipeline undertaken. You may come across a lot of detail in this, but how can we set the right direction? And how can we make it real? So this is a kind of a logical approach to delivering regenerative design. So understanding all the different contextual drivers, we set about developing a global framework to underpin this for Eden Project, to inform and then to be contextualized for each site's context. We looked at many different models, 5 capitals, planetary boundaries, SDGs, cradle to cradle, and then we selected the one that we felt actually suited Eden. Then we developed a framework for delivery, which then was used to grow from the bottom up and the top down. So thinking about the individual strategies for sites, but then at a portfolio level and how it can all be interconnected and targets set appropriately. And this is just an insight into some of the objectives we set. So creating more energy than we consume, delivering positive ecological impact, thinking about the communities and being responsible in citizenship, empowering everyone engaged, but also it's got to stack up. So thinking about how we can boost the economy and create local jobs. And how can we grow all capitals? This is the 5 capitals model. How can we grow all these capitals all the time? And this is thankfully embedded in the Eden Project North, which has just secured planning permission. And we work with Graham Shaw's, Bura and other Trivandi, other great organisations in delivering this. So I think this proves to be a great kickstart for this delivery of the global programme for Eden. So second case study is for a site in Yorkshire. It's an old utility site for Yorkshire Water. And we work with Yorkshire Water and their sister company, Keyland, thinking about this as a system. So that we believe regenerative design is all about system thinking, involving the right people at the right time and having a lot of diversity across the people involved to give a different perspective, so we can embed this within a potential solution that lives and stands the test of time. So on the left is how it looks at the minute, and now on the right is a visualization of a regenerated, thriving community, and a really positive, it has a positive impact locally and explores self-containment and circular systems as much as possible. So this starts from the top down. Keyland have their own blueprint, which thankfully we help them develop. It's got really strong values in there, and it translates that into what they expect of themselves and the people they work with and their supply chains. And then Yorkshire Water's land strategy, which again, thankfully, we help develop, thinking about how can they deliver a better land and support better lives. So systems thinking, this is just an illustration. So on this site, how can we actually think about the inputs and outputs and the various flows that are potentially on site already, and putting in interventions to support the better impact and the demonstration and delivery of impact across this. So we looked at various things like biogas production, vertical farming, supporting local communities, and recovering the resources currently flowing. Don't try and read this. This is an illustration about the inputs. We'd understood the inputs for each of these different work streams, then the outputs. So what goes in, what goes out, and then how we can actually connect things at a very granular level on the site. And then how then we can feed into the offsite potential, and then how can we build this system up around the inputs and the outputs to minimize the cost of the inputs, to be like self-serving, so a circular system, and then how can we maximize the value of the outputs to give benefit to society and to the clients, the landholders, and the people that actually choose to work, live, and play here. So these little tube, it's like a tube map basically, but these little tube stations are key to this. It's actually what happens in the middle and how we think about how we link them up. And it's all about the sum of its parts. And you can see all these lines of inputs and outputs generating potential changes in mass and energy. And really everything's a system, and all we're doing is moving energy and mass around. So we want to do that very locally, very efficiently, and very sustainably. And this is a diagram which shows how we then map these out to understand where we should locate these system components and how we can do it in such an efficient way that actually delivers this regenerative circular system. So this is an illustration of some of the impacts that we calculated, like a baseline scenario, thinking about how much CO2 is reduced by linking different work streams together, how much value is created annually from waste, recycling, and reuse, renewable energy, and actually the asset value and the net present value generated as well. And then thinking about this enhanced scenario where we can generate more jobs, benefit the community in much better ways, and generate more value and reduce the CO2 emissions and the impact on the planetary emergency. And this was part of the scheme. This was residential development, and it's in the REBA plan for use, Eschol Positive Living. So it's all about striving towards positive outcomes. And we try to link this in fully to this system, but actually in some areas it didn't quite work. And I think we've got to recognize that. And we've got to think about actually sometimes things are best done within a very granular locality to deliver what we want to realize in terms of the vision. So this is my last slide. How can, just some takeaways really that we're trying to share. Everything is a flow of mass and energy. How can a something at the end of its life be reincarnated? How can we make the best use of it? How can we reduce the timescales between death and rebirth? So what waste streams near me could have value. Thinking about actually linking it all together and reducing the distance of flows of energy and resources, and how can we benefit the local economy, and how can we demonstrate the additional value? How can we create jobs? How can we benefit society? How can we reduce the transport miles, improving the resilience, reducing resource costs, and really delivering something that is fully regenerative and helps us protect what I think is a great planet, and we all should cherish more. And so hopefully that's given some illustration of how we can embed this. Thanks, Ollie.
Thank you, Anthony. Can we have a round of applause for Anthony for that fantastic presentation? Thank you very much. Anthony, if I can invite you to stop sharing your screen. You know, I was interested seeing that your diagram there of sort of energy and mass, and actually seeing, you know, you're really delving into the practicalities of how to do this. I was thinking of a mycelium network in a forest doing exactly that, moving energy and mass around. And here we are trying to imitate and hopefully learning how to do what nature has been doing for rather a long time. So really fascinating to see these parallels. Thank you, Anthony. And so we move on to our fourth panelist, who is Adele Horton. Adele, over to you.
Okay, can you see my slides?
We can, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to join in this conversation today. And I think that hopefully some of the things that I talk about can pull together some of the threads of the earlier presenters. I am an architect, so I come at this from that perspective. I'd also like to bring in a conversation, more of a focus on the humans that live in our society and for whom we build our buildings and our built environment. And the reason why I say that is because when I first started working in the green building sector back in the early 2000s, really there was kind of this focus, and I think we've talked about this already a little bit, about green building and sustainability as being about efficiency. And how can we do more with less? And how can we, you know, make the case for, say, spending more money on green building technologies in order to spend less money later on during the occupancy phase? And over time, I just started wondering kind of what was the point? And because when you think about designing buildings and infrastructure, so much of the time when we focus on climate change, we're focusing on how we can make the infrastructure stronger to resist a climatic event. But the point of building the infrastructure in the first place was to allow for our society to live, to exist. And so that's how I kind of started focusing on this question of what's the role of people in this conversation. And I actually moved over into the public health field to learn more about the research that has gone on through social science methods to understand why is it that different populations have different outcomes for different health conditions. And I think we've seen that very strikingly during the COVID pandemic, where there are groups of our society that have a historic difficulty and access to what we call in public health the underlying social determinants of health. So access to education, access to healthcare, access to economic prosperity. And they also tend to be located in areas of our cities and towns that expose them to environmental pollutants that increase the stress on their bodies. And so you end up seeing these clusters of similar population groups who have higher prevalence of cancer, of asthma, of comorbidities. That means having multiple conditions that they're dealing with all at the same time. And then these are also the same populations who then we have seen during COVID were more likely to be exposed to the virus because they're the ones who have the jobs that require them to go out and be an interface with the population, when those of us who have more means at our disposal were able to stay home or had jobs that allowed us to work from home. And I think that to me, the exciting thing about bringing this kind of public health lens to a conversation about built environment and particularly climate change and regenerative design is that those are the exact same populations who are most likely to have negative health outcomes when an extreme heat event occurs, when a flooding event occurs, when a hurricane occurs. So those are our vulnerable populations. And we see that if we were to focus on addressing those underlying social determinants of health, that we could actually increase the resilience of the entire society, because those are the people that need the most help. And so that's kind of where I ended up now, kind of starting out where I was really just looking at environmental conditions as a green building architect, and then moving into public health and learning more about, you know, the distribution of disease through a population and where it's located, and now trying to bring those two together. So I just wanted to share very briefly a case study of how I've done that. And that's mainly using health impact assessment methodology and applying it to the design process. And so this example is from the Twin Cities in the US in Minnesota. We were looking at 3 different neighborhoods that were along a 4-mile stretch of a light rail line that was being built to link downtown St. Paul, Minnesota to downtown Minneapolis. And we were looking at 3 different housing projects. One was a mixed use multifamily housing. One was a renovation of a single family historic house. And the third was what we call in the US affordable housing, sort of public housing. And by looking at the differences in the environmental conditions on and around the site and the neighborhood, as well as how the demographics shift from block to block and within a neighborhood and from that neighborhood to the next neighborhood, we were able to identify a different set of design strategies that you would want to prioritize in those different neighborhoods, even though we were generally talking about the same building type housing. So I'm just going to show one slide about this, but there's a whole health impact assessment I could share in the chat during the panel's discussion. We looked at a number of different chronic diseases as well as climate change. I'm just going to talk about extreme heat just because of the topic today. But what you can see is that we looked at the underlying vulnerabilities of the population within these 3 neighborhoods. So we looked at, you know, income level, race, ethnicity, and age groups. And you can see that given those different demographic and socioeconomic factors, that different health issues popped up as being high concern in that top part of the slide. And then we looked at the exposures of the environment, a range of topics that were related to chronic disease and climate change. And again, you can see, to me, the big takeaway from this slide is the heterogeneity. You can see that things shift from one neighborhood to the next. And as a result, what we ended up with were design strategies that were different, even though we were talking about the same climatic exposure, in this case, extreme heat. So I'd just like to leave it there, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with the panel.
Thank you very much, Adele. Please, can we have a round of applause for Adele? Thank you very much. Wow, what a great, dense, diverse set of viewpoints on this. Really, really fascinating. So we're going to open up the discussion now. What I would invite you to, well, I'm going to, you can either put your hand up or you can post your question in the chat, and Andrew is going to help me figure out who's saying what. I'm actually going to go to a question that I've seen come up here first from Nicholas Falk, who, well, Nicholas, I wonder if I could ask you to raise the question that you put in the chat verbally.
Okay, I'll try to do that. First of all, I found all the presentations impressive, fascinating, and very convincing. However, at the back of my mind was the question, how does one persuade investors in property in particular to do things differently and to not only invest over the long term, but possibly do things quite differently from what they would see as the easy thing to do? And it seemed to me that there was an issue about how to link economics the dismal science, with engineering. And I'm not sure whether engineers get any induction into land economics. I'd be interested to hear. But it does seem to me that if this is to really change the way we build cities, then somehow one has to bring out always the implications on costs of all kinds and of values of all kinds. And maybe that's what you do automatically. But if you don't, it seems to me important if one is to persuade investors to buy or invest in different kinds of things.
Thank you, Nicholas. So this question of land economics and how we bring this into the debate. Would any of our panelists like to respond to that and get the conversation going on this topic? Let's go. I saw Kian's hand up first. Over to you.
I'm happy to start,
Please do.
and then other people can correct me. Well, so there's a couple of things with this. So first of all, there's the discussion of to whether or not the existing systems make sense, and so whether or not those systems need to change completely. And so we can always think about things in the existing systems, but those existing systems have led us to the climate catastrophe that we're in right now, and so we acknowledge that those need to change. So there's that part. From having been someone who studied engineering, we do study economics, so we do have a background in that. And often, as most practitioners, we come into a situation where we're all discussing money as an argument. But I think everyone is. I think the industry is becoming more aware that money isn't the only answer. I think that there was a time when you would bid on something and you'd give a number, and now it's becoming much more complicated. And what's interesting is I was discussing this at the National Conference of Builders yesterday. Is that they were talking about that often when a project goes through and they get the minimum cost, that's not what most clients end up paying anyway. There's always tiny things that change. And so actually, most of the time, it becomes more attractive to choose one that is a reasonable cost, but also has the other parts that you're concerned with. So I think that's my loose answer to your question.
Great, thank you, Ken. Over to Anthony.
Yes, very interesting question, Nicholas. Thanks for that. And I think what came to mind when I saw it in the chat was about how you define value. And like what we try to share with everybody is about defining a more holistic understanding of value on the balance sheet. So thinking about impact investing and thinking about, there's a trend, and I think it is going to transform the way investment is placed. And so, think not just about the financial return, but thinking about what matters to us, society, and the world and future generations. And, as we had the capitals model on the screen earlier, thinking about natural, social, human, manufactured, intellectual even as well, and financial capital, and then monetizing that. And one of our graphs was attempting to do that, really. So it's how we define value and how we communicate the value of that. I think that's important. And as I said, like impact investing is really hitting home, and like pension funds and anything else. Ollie.
Anthony, sorry, Ollie, I'm just going to say Anthony's completely right with that. And we've already seen investors have been like ditching assets because they're finding it harder to find tenants for projects buildings that they own that are unsustainable. We also have large landowners also realizing that they can think about their buildings as a system. Grosvenor is working with Hain to steel on a project where they're actually taking steel from other projects in order to make the new building. So like we're seeing this change already happening.
Thank you, Ken. Let's go over to, I saw Adele and then both. Let's go to Adele, then on to Michael. Adele.
Great, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, I wanted to expand on what Anthony said. I don't know, I wanted to put a plug in for a book recently that's actually out of University College London called Mission Economy. I don't know if any of you guys have read it. Mariana Mazzucato wrote it. And I found it really interesting because when, I work in this realm of trying to make the case that a community health benefit is actually going to bring a financial benefit to real estate developers, right? That can be a hard case to make. But what I find interesting about her concept around mission economy is this idea that the public sector and the private sector need to rethink their relationship with each other, and that the public sector might need to start investing more directly into what currently in many industrialized countries sits entirely in the private sector's domain. And that is one way to begin to overcome this sort of wrong pocket syndrome that we have, particularly around public health, where if you focus your design on with a propose that there's probably going to be a benefit to public health, which means population health benefit, it's hard to say that who's going to benefit from that. It's a long-term diffuse benefit. And so that is generally in kind of economic terms would be seen as something that would be beneficial to the state, not to the private sector. And so thinking about how we renegotiate that relationship is a way to begin to answer this question.
Okay, thank you very much, Adele. I'm quickly going to go to Michael, and then we're going to pick up another question from the chat. Michael.
Okay, well, I'm going to try and stir things up a bit by being radical. But you know, the word radical, it tends to be associated with extreme left-wing views, and that's not where I'm coming from. I'm using the term radical in the sense of its original etymology, which is about getting to the root of the problem. And I don't think we will get to the root of the problem by trying to persuade investors with commercial arguments. I think that leaves us stuck very much in the sustainability paradigm, and we're just not going to make the progress we need to get into the realm of regenerative design. And so I think before working on a project, it's important to check that your deep purpose is aligned. And frankly, I wouldn't bother working with a client that said something like, one that said to me recently, well, you know, whatever you come up with, it's got to be bankable. You've got to be able to take this to the bank. We've got to make a profit out of it. Well, sorry, I'm not even going to bother with that. Because unless your deep purpose is aligned with long-term regenerative ideas, it's just going to be a waste of time trying to work with that. And so, you know, I increasingly think that we need to transform companies. And you know, it's interesting that the B Corp movement, part of becoming a B Corp is you have to define a proper purpose for your company. It's not enough to just say, well, you're about returning profit to your shareholders. And the thing is, when I meet a very commercial client who says that they want it all to stack up financially, they think they're being clever. But I think future generations will regard their mindset as that of a psychopath. Seriously, you know, someone who really has no care for the impact of their actions on other people. There we go. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for kind of keeping us attuned to the fact that we can't solve this by accidentally trying to use our existing thinking. And yeah, so I really appreciate that. I'm going to go back to the chat and a question from Alexi, which was, well, around the best barometer of health behavior. I'm going to invite Alexi to use your own words to say that. Alexi.
Hello, thanks, Ollie. Adele, my question was triggered by your presentation because when you talk about health of the population or, you know, as a barometer, as a measure, my question really was, well, what do you think about behavior within, you know, surely behavior is the kind of primary point of kind of change. And Anthony touched on it as well. I mean, what are your thoughts about how behavior is linked to regenerative design and those spaces enabling themselves to be regenerative? They don't do it on their own. They're not automated. So I'm really interested in your thinking around that. Thanks.
Thanks for that question. I think that is such an important point. And the way that I think about behavior is in several senses. First, behavior isn't the only thing that leads to a health outcome, right? So you can be exposed to COVID sitting on an airplane just because you happen to be sitting there and somebody next to you happens to have COVID, right? If you're located next to a freeway and that's where your house is located and you don't have air conditioning and so you have to open your window, then you know your children have a higher risk of having asthma because they are exposed to particulate matter on a daily basis. So there's an exposure aspect of this. And I think a lot of the time when we think about behavior, we tend to think about it as a personal choice. And I think that what's really powerful about bringing the concept of public health into communication and dialogue with engineering and architecture is to realize that we as people working in the built environment sector actually create a context within which that behavior is either promoted or we put up barriers to that, to what we consider healthy behavior, right? So I think that that's the first step. And then you make the excellent point, which is that just because we say install a staircase that's right, at the entrance of our building, and we hope people will use it, that doesn't mean people are actually going to use that staircase. And there actually are a lot of interesting studies watching people do everything they can to not use the staircase, right? So I think one of the things that I found really interesting as thinking about changing our mindset as people working in the built environment is that many times the design process is thought of as ending when we turn the keys over to the owner. But in fact, we need to start thinking about how what we're doing right now can already start talking with the people who are going to then activate that space once the space is being used. And that's how we begin to think in a kind of longer term thinking, as some of the other panelists have mentioned, so that we're just a piece of a larger life cycle for that building or that development. And the behavior isn't necessarily going to just happen spontaneously. It has to be programmed and desired by the occupants. And there is going to be ongoing effort in terms of promoting the kinds of behavior that will promote health, and also protecting occupants from exposures as they become evident within a space.
Thank you very much, Adele. And if I might just add, I mean, there's a strong overlap, I feel, there with what Kian was saying around is it just a stop-start relationship, or is it a longitudinal thing? And how do we break out of our kind of quite traditional role on projects as built environment professionals? It's opening that space out. If I may, go on, Kian, quickly, and then I'll go.
No, it's fine. So on kind of following on from Adele's point, is that if you give someone a green building, but they don't use it in a particular way, then it's never going to be green. So there is a relationship of the person, and that's kind of where those nested holes, like even if you go up and down, you as a person are part of those systems. And so that's why one of the books that I recommended is Carol Sanford's Regenerative Life, which is talking about kind of how we need to change, like personal change needs to happen in order to manifest larger system change.
Thank you, Kian. If I may, I'm going to take another question to keep things moving. Slightly different question here. Ziona, you had a question about what we expect from the built fabric. I wonder if you could speak to that point, please.
Hi, thanks very much. And just referring back to Adele, I spend my career studying how people use buildings after they've been delivered and handed over, not only at that point in time, but over time. And I'm really concerned about how, as makers of the built environment, we just still assume so much environmental determinism. And I don't disagree at all with Adele about the scope we have to facilitate or mitigate negative health impacts. But I'm much more concerned about the regenerative potential of what we do in terms of inclusive social participation. That is economic, that is personally developmental, that's life enriching, that comes back to Michael's point, that time is life. And the sorts of things that I hear repeatedly are about our need as built environment professionals to curate the content of what goes on in buildings and on campuses, etc. And it really bugs me because we don't even do the things that we specially trained to do particularly well. And then there is this kind of power grab that to try to make our output more stickable, we seem to want to think that we've also got to curate the programming. I actually heard those words already in this conversation. And so I'm interested in what any of our panelists or other participants in this meeting think about the potential of our work to promote social and economic participation.
Thank you, Ziona. And so I think that was to Adele first. I wonder also, for my benefit, if you could, or somebody could explain environmental determinism, because I'm not sure what it means. But thank you. If someone could mention that in their answer, that would be great.
Sure. I'm happy to do a first crack at this, and I'd really interested in hearing what the other panelists, what their responses are, because I do feel like there were nuggets, yeah, in other presentations. So environmental determinism, from the way, or determinism, the way I think about it is, we see it in architecture schools all the time. I'm not sure, I'm not an engineer, but I don't know if it happens in engineering schools. The idea that we design a building and then we assume that the way we design it is going to result in certain behaviors. And I think we all know that people choose to use their surroundings in very creative ways. And just because the designer just, designed it with a certain intention doesn't mean that that's the way that the users are going to use it. And so I think that's a really important point, Ziona, and it is something that I hope, I've been glad to see since I left architecture school, that this idea of determinism is hopefully on its way out. And the idea of co-creating design with the community and with the future occupants is something that is becoming more in vogue. I think also thinking again about this idea of a longer term timeline, that where you all are located, there is a built environment and a natural environment that has been inhabited for thousands of years. And just because a building is there or an infrastructure is there doesn't mean that it's going to be used in the way that it originally was intended when it was first built. So I think there's a long history of adaptive reuse. And I think in particular, the conversation earlier about how can human society begin to realign and come up and create a new relationship with nature so that we see ourselves as part of nature and in dialogue with nature. To me, thinking about health, it's one of the most visceral, easy ways to begin to think about that, right? We are animals that can get sick. We die, we're born, we're mammals. And so that thinking about it from a health lens is one way to kind of start easing into that conversation about the way that human society and natural ecosystems can be more of a productive system, as opposed to sort of separating ourselves and trying to then dominate this thing that we think of as other as being nature.
Yeah, so it's timely to bring back into the frame that term long life, loose fit, which, it's so simple, but I think it is at the heart of regenerative potential.
Ollie.
Kian, please, and then we'll go Kian.
No, I actually don't entirely believe that long life loose fit works. I think projects have been built on the premise of long life loose fit, and then they get demolished because they're not loose enough fit. And I actually think adaptation and deconstruction and reusability is much more important in that process. So for example, the building might get knocked down because there just isn't enough head height to put in the ventilation system needed to do that. So the whole building gets knocked down. If it was adaptable, that floor could be increased. That to me seems to be the way to do this. But to come back to the other point about behavior, is that I think acknowledging that our buildings will evolve and how we can create ways that we can, as designers, the opportunities for that evolution, to creating soft walls where we think soft walls might be needed in the future. I'm being really specific here, but this is just kind of an idea. It's just ways that we can make sure that the building can evolve in the future. For example, even putting hard concrete on the ground makes it difficult to make any changes digging down or growing in the future. So I think that's just some changes we could make.
Thank you, Kian. If I could bring Michael in on this point as well, Michael.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Ziona. I think that the form of the built environment is to some extent a reflection of how we see ourselves as humans, and it also, once built, it does determine quite a bit about how we behave. And so, as one example, suburban sprawl with lots of isolated individual buildings. That's partly a result of economic and planning policy, but it's also partly a result of seeing humans as separate individuals in a competitive zero-sum game. And if we were to look at the opposite of that, and that's what Sarah and I do in Flourish, we put forward the opposite of that as being symbiogenesis. So that was a term coined by Lynn Margulis, the biologist, who found that organisms that evolve in symbiosis, over time, they develop new structures that further enhance that mutualism. And so Sarah and I speculate on what that would mean for cities. And we also take a lot of inspiration actually from George Monbiot's point, which is that we need to shift from the current situation of private luxury and public squalor towards one of private sufficiency and public luxury. And if we do that, we could create a really good quality of life for everyone with a fraction of the resources, a fraction of the land. And if Lynn Margulis is to be believed in her theory of symbiogenesis, then that would become a self-reinforcing situation. So those enhancements to our quality of life and social interaction and so on, they would be self-reinforcing.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm going to take two questions at once now from the audience, and we will pick those up together. So the first question I'm going to go to is from Ashish, and I think this came a little bit earlier. Ashish, are you there? You are muted, but you are there. Oh, do you know what? I'm good. Hello.
Okay, great. So I think I'm audible now. So my question is first of all, thank you so much. And it gives us a lot of perspectives, and they are really, really important. And particularly, I am, impressed by the way the panelists have put their thoughts and perspective. So thanks to all the panelists. My question, I'm as an engineer, I'm working with Bureau Happold, and my question is related to engineering aspect of it. The opportunities and challenges the panelists see in the regenerative design in greenfield versus brownfield development, because a lot of greenfield projects are happening, but at the same time in developed countries and in larger cities, redevelopment projects are also happening. So how do we see the challenges and opportunities in these both scenarios?
Okay, thank you, Ashish. And I will take the question from Tom as well, Tom Dolan. Tom, are you there?
Hi, thanks.
Thank you.
I was wondering how we could get more of this excellent thinking into government strategies. UK examples like around net zero, jet zero, infrastructure strategy, the energy security strategy, and also how we transform things like the outcome from COP, which for me was systemically, scientifically, ecologically, economically illiterate, how we transform outcomes like that into something better by using the type of thinking you're espousing. So two questions there, I think.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. So just playing those back to our panel. So we have from Ashish a question about the opportunities and challenges of greenfield versus brownfield development. And then our question from Tom, or two questions really, how do we get this into government strategy and really try to create a better outcome from things like COP? Anyone want to go first from the panel? So, Kian, over to you.
I'll do it because, yeah. So going to the brownfield and greenfield site, I think that's a really interesting thing, and I've not thought about it. So this is kind of my thoughts coming from this discussion. It's really interesting. I'm taking a leaf out of blue-green infrastructure. Blue-green infrastructure is the model of moving away from like just piping everything to actually embracing green spaces and blue spaces as a way of dealing with water in cities. And it's really interesting that they've seen in their projects that my friend Nanko Dolman has been working on, is that essentially that the developed countries who have tons of this kind of inbuilt infrastructure have a really hard time changing. And actually they found that other countries that don't necessarily have so much piped infrastructure are doing this thing called scale jumping. They're able to actually embrace these systems much quicker, create much more ecologically friendly systems quicker, because they don't have to deal with that history of all the grey or that kind of piped infrastructure, and they can create green spaces and water spaces to deal with those. So in my head, one of my first things would be that I think that actually that the kind of European countries are going to have a harder time doing this than non-European countries. So there's that. And then coming to it, I think both of those situations, brownfield and greenfield, are very interesting. Brownfield is an opportunity because you know that that place needs to be improved. So actually it's a really nice, as part of your process, you can be improving. So that's a really nice thing that you can get your teeth around as part of your project. And greenfield have another difficulty, that there's already existing ecosystem there. So actually whatever you build has to kind of retain, improve that ecosystem. So it's kind of like it's in some ways I'd like to think that it's easier to build in the brownfield than in the greenfield, but that doesn't exactly marry up with my thought on scale jumping from blue-green infrastructure. So then just to touch on Tom's point, I was going to say that generally I think that, like, from the lessons I've learned from carbon discussions, is that it seems to be the cycle of politicians not saying the industry is ready, and the industry saying that policy isn't ready, so there's no change. And so really it's about, if everyone becomes educated, if everyone is ready, then I think that these things will change. And so I think that's one of my big takeaways.
Thank you, Kian. I'm going to go to Anthony and then Michael. Anthony.
Thanks. Really interesting conversation, and we get asked this quite often, or have done in the past. And I just remembered a phrase I think that Ted Happel said about touching the earth lightly, and you inspired me to say, Kian, and thinking about, you know, when it's a dichotomy between greenfield and brownfield developments. I think if you use a very structured approach to understand and exploit the opportunities and constraints, what's there in the ground, what's above the ground, to really think about the ecosystem as it currently stands and how you can enact positive change and positive strategies to really move towards regeneration. I think that's it. But so I think hopefully some of what we were trying to convey in my presentation slides, having a logical framework and an approach and a structure that applies, I think you can use that to make sure you do the best you can across a very holistic outlook. So embracing the natural systems where you can, not looking to mechanize systems at all, and thinking about actually the people and how they're going to live there, and try and really make it low tech. But yeah, I think, you know, the whole touch earth lightly, I think it was central to philosophy throughout my career, and I think it's employing that, Ollie.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And Michael.
Yeah, so I think there's a really important debate to be had about how change happens, and I'm responding really to Tom's question here. And I do really recommend Donella Meadows' essay Leverage Points, because you know, she makes the point very persuasively that it's very difficult to bring about significant change just tweaking little bits of system behavior. And I used to think that was the way to bring about change. I spent, you know, at least 10 years working on what I thought were transformative projects. But yeah, Donella Meadows argues that really you have to try and change things much up in the kind of leverage points that she describes. So changing the paradigm or changing the goals of the system. And I think that, you know, the urgency of the planetary situation now is such that we really do have to try and intervene at those most influential points. And I don't think we're going to get very far by just making kind of polite approaches to government saying, well, could you do a little bit more of this and so on. I think we really need to change the system. And in Tim Jackson's book, I think it's called Beyond Growth or Beyond Capitalism or something, he talks about having a meeting with someone in the Treasury and talking about his ideas for changing ideas about growth. And the guy from the Treasury said, well, how's that going to look at the next G20 meeting? And we've slipped down the rankings. And I was a little surprised that Tim Jackson didn't have a good answer to that. And he just sort of reflected on that being the kind of mentality of the bully boy, which it is. But I think a better answer would have been, well, sod the G20, you know, they're past their sell-by date. What we should be doing is joining the WeGo group, the Wellbeing Group of Governments, which was initiated by Scotland, Iceland, and New Zealand, and has now been joined by Finland and Wales. And they're committed to a completely different purpose for the economy, a purpose that maximizes well-being, not growth. And you might then say, well, how on earth are we going to persuade government to do that? And that's partly the thinking behind Architects Declare, which I was involved in initiating. You know, we know that a lot of the changes we need are very difficult to bring about at the scale of an individual company or an individual project. And so as a result, we need large coalitions, ideally cross-industry coalitions, that compel government to bring about these kind of changes. And that's something that we're actively doing. We have put forward a whole list of strategic policy changes to the government that we need. And we're still in that process. And I hope we're going to make some progress so far. We haven't yet, but we're steadily kind of winding up the pressure. And I'll be able to report a bit more on that in maybe a month or so.
Great, thank you, Michael. If I may, I'd like to put a question to the panel, which is this: a lot of people, when they're kind of encountering this regenerative design debate, I experience, kind of think, how do we change our existing system towards this? But there's almost a kind of blinkers on around the fact that the world is going to change anyway. We're on a trajectory to 3 point something. The world as we know it is going to be very different in 10 years' time. So it's not a case of trying to influence a fixed static system. It's about trying to influence something which is changing anyway. I would like to ask the panelists, what opportunities do you think that change might bring for implementing this agenda? Michael.
Well, the ancient Greeks differentiated between two different types of time. There was chronos, which is ordinary chronological time, and there's kairos, which is opportune time. And the reason that's worth distinguishing is because there are certain times when it's much easier to bring about dramatic change. And moments of crisis include that. So, you know, I hope that the pandemic will spur us to rethink some of the things that we used to take for granted. And the Ukraine crisis is another situation like that. And what we really need is integrative thinking. And there's rather a lack of that at government and business level at the moment. And often problems, counterintuitively, problems can be easier to solve if you bring more complexity into them. And so, you know, if we just try and solve the cost of living crisis, it's going to be very difficult. If we just try and solve climate change, it's going to be very difficult. But if you were to try and address those challenges simultaneously, you could so look at the figures, and it turns out that last year we spent £4 billion on Russian oil. Now, for £3 billion, you could make every single bus fare in the UK free. That would reduce congestion. It would make it much easier for people on low incomes. We then wouldn't need to spend the planned £27 billion on expanding the road network. We could instead spend that on upgrading people's homes, starting with the most fuel-poor households. And if we did those things together, we would address climate change, the cost of living crisis, congestion, health and well-being, and we would turn off the tap that is feeding Vladimir Putin's war machine.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to go to Anthony.
Thank you. So slightly different approach to an answer here, or just to share thoughts. Do we actually understand our system? I think we should. And there's so much data flowing around our system right now than there was in the past. We need to be better. We need to use that in a more informed way, evidence-based approaches, and bring it all together into a very informed way of thinking, really. So you're right, our system is changing quite much more rapidly than it used to in certain areas. And so use the data, be more informed. And I think the youngsters are I'm talking as a dad now, so it's like thinking about my kids are actually going through so much change, and their lifestyles are so different to how mine was. So thinking about, okay, the future generations, how can we use the data to help change our system from a top-down governmental level, the policy levers, but also understanding the rapid change from a human level and connecting the two, really. So evidence-based approaches are really critical.
Thank you, Anthony. And Adele.
Yeah, and I'd like to actually think about this a little bit also in response to the previous two questions. One of the problems that we have in the US is that after there's a major disaster, there's a lot of federal money that goes to that location that is then used for rebuilding efforts. And over the past 15, 20 years, there's been a movement to try and change the rules around how do you use that money, so that rather than just building exactly what was there previously, that you use those funds to be forward thinking about how does that community need to change to be resilient in the face of a changing world. And in some cases, that includes moving to a new location and leaving that place. And I think the conversation earlier about how so much infrastructure is already in place and how expensive that is and how long-term that is once you put it in the ground has been a real attenuating factor in allowing us to kind of conceptualize what a future might look like that is more adaptive and resilient and regenerative. And I think that there are, at least in the US, policies that stand in the way of taking that approach of being more forward thinking. And just to be very specific also, there's also a movement afoot to require including climate projections into HVAC models. Because right now, at least in the US, when you design the air conditioning system for a building, you're using historical data in a world, to your point, Ollie, that is changing. And it's changing very rapidly. And so the number of cooling degree days that you're going to experience in that location during the lifespan of that building is, the models show quite much higher than the number that is you're being required to design for. And so we're building buildings today that we know are not future proofed. So that's an opportunity, and second Anthony, that we have a lot of data available that we could be using to kind of start thinking in that way and designing towards the future.
Thank you very much, Adele. And actually, I think this is kind of turning into quite a sort of concludey kind of question I've asked it here. So I think everyone's responded to this except for Kian. So I'm going to give Kian the final mic if you had any thoughts you wanted to add as we begin to wrap up.
All right. No. So I think most of the main points related to this have been said. It's an open door. 2018 IPCC report has kind of changed our views. Like our industry hasn't changed since the 2018, since the 2009 recession, where there's tightening of belts. Now there's like a tightening of carbon, and so we're kind of pushing at an open door, and it's really nice we can say, hey, here's sustainability like near the door, and then further into the room, you could imagine the idea of regenerative thinking, and it's really interesting that we're having these shocks. We're experiencing climate shocks. We're also experiencing political shocks like the Ukraine crisis. And it's showing us that some of our old ideas no longer hold true, that, oh, there's no need to insulate this because the price of heating this house is so cheap. And as Adele said, the heating prices, the cost of heating goes up. And so actually the insulation becomes much more attractive. So I think we can no longer, even saying that there is existing systems no longer really holds true. And we've tried resilience, and resilience just leads to thicker and thicker and harder and stronger, which again, there's no end point to it because the events keep shocking us. And so actually designing for adaptation, thinking of communities, like even in COVID, we saw that it was actually communities adapting and kind of coming together that was one of the really big saving points of that. And so we're like, in some ways, we're seeing the evidence that the regenerative thinking works. We're seeing an open door. So I just kind of think that it's sharing and talking about it and developing it more is going to be a really positive thing.
Thank you very much again. If I might add as a sort of concluding mark, something I always put up in my training slides is the line that you only learn if you do difficult things. And I think we all need to learn what regenerative practice means, which means we're all going to need to do difficult things. We won't get there necessarily by doing the easy stuff, but I think we all realize this is an important thing we all want to learn about. So I will conclude by saying, do difficult things to help us understand what this is all about. I'd like to conclude by thanking our speakers, Michael Paulin, Kieran Malik, Anthony Davis, Adele Horton, and I am Oliver Broadbent. Thank you very much to also the Hubble Foundation for hosting us. Let's give our speakers a final round of applause, and to all our participants, thank you very much.